Dean and Matthew, welcome virtually anyway to the bookshop. How are you guys?
Good. Yourself?
Very happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. I'm just enjoying the sunset out the window and glad to be sat here with you as well. We're here to talk about the first publication by Urban Avalon and a book that one of the earlier books we had at the bookshop. So I'll leave it up to you who wants to fill us in with what Urban Avalon is and where it came from.
Sure. So Urban Avalon is probably as brand new as your bookshop is. This only started back as an actually formed idea, I'd say maybe September, October of last year. And here in Montreal, there's a zine festival that happens at the end of November. I'm not sure if it happens at the end of November every year consecutively, but around that time, yearly, there's a zine festival that Dean had attended once before. And I had been invited by a few other local photographers who wanted to create kind of like a little photo corner by renting out some tables and all kind of grouping together at this event. And I had a few of my own publications to sell that wasn't associated to anything, just self-release stuff. And I'd had this idea of doing a press here in Canada that focused on Canadian photographers, because I feel that Canadian photographers don't get that much of a highlight outside of their own little microcosms in the cities that they exist in. And I wanted a way to create something that could maybe, breach that barrier a little bit. And so for the first publication, I'd had a series of photographs that I had lying around that were, I wouldn't say outliers, but just maybe a little bit different from what I usually do. I'm usually a monochrome shooter, and this was a very color-oriented set of photographs that had a very different mindset behind them. And a lot of them were actually made while going on photo walks with Dean, who's been a friend of mine for, I guess, 3 or 4 years. We've been friends now.
Like during the pandemic, came across each other's work, and then started to go on some photo walks in some of the most unphotogenic places in Montreal. So that's kind of like where we're attracted to shoot. So we found that in common, and then kind of went from there. For sure.
Yeah. So for the first publication, I decided to do a collaboration with Dean. So I wanted, the first thing I did with Urban Avalon Press to not only highlight someone else's work, but to do a collaboration with someone else. And future plans I have for the zine right now are for the press are all collaborative zines. That's kind of where I want to go. Nothing else, including myself. Everything else from this point on will be between 2 other artists. But just to get the first experience going, I wanted to work with someone that I knew. And someone that was local, and someone that we shared a very similar interest and love in for photography and subject matter, location, ideas and philosophies and stuff like that. So I wanted it to be a nice seamless experience, and we decided to make our kind of pressure point being the Expo zine. So I think I pitched it to you in October to officially get things going, I think.
Yeah, I think we'd been talking about doing something for a while. And then just this came up, and it worked perfectly with the timing.
Yeah, exactly. So kind of use that as like a boiling over point to be like, okay, let's get this thing out there so we can display it at Expo Zine. And
Yeah. I had a kind of a long relationship actually with Expo Zine. I previously had more of a writing practice, a fiction writing practice. And so as early as 2010, I was a part of Expo Zine tabling my fiction books. And then with the pandemic, transitioned into a photography practice very organically, and started to produce like a lot more photography. And last year, a poetry publisher in Toronto put out my first zine, and which was sold at Expo Zine, which this year won the best Anglophone zine at the Expo Zine Awards. So, and that was my first publication. So it was a nice surprise to see photography getting a little bit of notice at Expo Zine, because it hasn't in the past. And And definitely, it's also great to see more photographers coming and like putting their work out there, and that really is hitting a cultural moment, I feel like, in Montreal.
That's cool. Nice. Oh, just because you touched on you had a writing practice before, and then I also know that Matt, I've seen you posting a bit about your Substack as well recently.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I'd be curious to kind of ask about how writing and photography kind of either influence each other, maybe come together in your practices, if at all, because we talk to people who I'm noticing a thread there of people who connect those two.
For me, I was writing a very dystopian novel when the pandemic hit, and it was just like too much dystopia, like in here, out there kind of thing. So I started to take stress walks in the alleys and just taking photos of the kind of material realities of the Montreal alley, the kind of textures and just the light and like very quotidian, everyday things that can be exceptional when, you know, framed correctly. And I just something started clicking, so to speak, with that. And it's kind of the opposite of writing in a lot of ways, in that it's like putting me out into the world, physically active, getting further and exploring industrial neighborhoods and residential neighborhoods I'd never been to, eventually getting me on my bike. So it's this engaging with my environment. And the way that I've described it in the past too is that writing is a way of approaching the outside world through your interiority, whereas photography is a way of approaching your interiority through the outside world. And so like the kind of sensitivity that it involves and requires to kind of recognize these opportunities is really like kind of exciting for me. And, you know, I've called it the alchemy of the mundane in the past. And yeah, there's something really inspiring about that for me. And you know, I haven't given up on writing. And in fact, I'm writing more about photography actually than I ever have, just by doing interviews. And Matthew and I did a talk for the book as well, which was up on his Substack, I believe, or the Urban Avalon.
Yeah, the Urban Avalon stuff, yeah.
So I am writing still, but I find myself writing more about photography. And this novel is kind of frozen. It's like in the freezer, but you know, it still kind of lives in my mind in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Nice.
No, I think, I mean, a lot of what Dean said kind of reflects in myself. Like, I have no background in fiction writing or anything like that. My writing practice has been purely, for the most part, journalistic. You know, just sharing a more public version of what a private journal would normally be. And I think a lot of it comes from that same kind of gesture of, you know, photography being, you know, exploring one's interior with the outside world. And, you know, whenever you write about photography, then you're, you know, reviewing the outside through the inside. You know, it kind of has like a, you know, a reverse effect whenever you start to write about it. And I think a lot of my writing practice has simply been about understanding my own photographs and, you know, sharing that publicly to, you know, maybe help other people find insight in their own work as well. But a lot of it is purely for myself. I have started changing that a little bit more as of late, where I started doing book reviews, and, you know, I will be posting more things on process and practice through my personal Substack. And then whenever we all do publications with Urban Avalon, there'll definitely be interviews with the artists that are involved, like as I did with Dean. And the thing that I did with Dean, I actually took from the writer, curator, photographer, David Campany. He has a fantastic book, which I'm going to forget the name of right now because I'm terrible at remembering titles. But he has a fantastic book where primarily, I would say 80% of the interviews in the book were conducted via email. So it allowed each person time to really reflect on their answers and respond versus, you know, like a kind of an instantaneous thing like we're doing here right now. And so that was kind of like the conversation I engaged Dean in for our first zine, just to kind of have a better understanding how we both went about the process of, pairing images, selecting images, the sequencing of the zine, design, this, that, the other thing. And yeah, I mean, for me, writing is just really just a way just to kind of take the meat of the photograph and just try to understand what it means. Like, I'm a huge fan of Tim Carpenter, and his his book, Photographers Learn How to Die, and a lot of that book is just about talking about the limitations of the human body comparable to the limitations of the camera, and how our bodies are in relationship to the world. And I think a lot of the work that I do, and I know I think Dean could probably relate as well, is subject matter is not really so much what is the heart of the photograph. It's more about the form of the image itself. And I think a lot of form making comes from the fact that I mean, in order for us to survive as humans, we have to constantly calibrating ourselves with the outside world, making sense of all the chaos that is around us. And I think a lot of that comes through when working with a camera, when going on photo walks and being on the ground. You're constantly reassessing your environment with your relationship with your body to the exterior world, and trying to manage that chaos. So I find, trying to write about it really interesting, because it's one of those things where it's just like, there are some types of styles of photography that are, very subject driven, and, the subject is what's spoken about. Whereas, I mean, if I were to look at what I photograph, there are subject themes I could relate, and I'm sure Dean could definitely relate the same way. There are subcategories of subjects that one is attracted to. But I think the more interesting thing is like the distance from these subjects, or the way you put your body towards it. How you're using depth of field, how you're using lighting and stuff like that is maybe slightly, to me, more interesting than the subject matter itself. It's the form of the subject. So yeah. That's kind of a long-winded answer, but
no, that was.
I think I can speak to that too, in terms of the fact that for me, like, the frame is the ultimate constraint, right? And like Wittgenstein said, the world is all that is the case. And for the photographer, the frame is all that is the case. And there's something incredibly satisfying about that, about moving through space and being able to basically curate reality, and you decide. And we look at other photographers to see the rules, and we discard them immediately, because really at the end of the day, the frame is the beginning and the ending, and you have the power to decide what and how that frame is filled. And that is really where I get a lot of my motivation to go out and be in the world. And it just the practice of being out there is a creative process, and that you're engaging with the world. And the world is generous, and you can go out in any conditions, and I really try to. Like, I was out in a -20 yesterday, walking in a neighborhood, and when you got to take that photo and take those gloves off, and I wear my coat under my jacket, like, it better be a damn good photo, you know what I mean? Because and I'm hitting the coffee shop to warm up after half an hour or an hour, but it's worth it, because those conditions produce really particular kinds of photos. And unfortunately, in Montreal, when it's sunny in the winter, it's also really cold.
Very cold. Yeah, exactly.
So, so I don't know, like, you kind of learn to appreciate all the different conditions and all the different opportunities as you keep going, and you get to know the light and the seasons. And it's a way of knowing the world, to know your craft, in a sense. And as you keep building that, I feel like you can make richer images and more informed images as well.
I think it's also a way of knowing yourself as well, because the more you engage with that practice of kind of like deconstructing the world around you, is you'll sometimes identify that sometimes things just aren't working because what's inside isn't working. There are days where you're just not aligned with the world at all. I mean, I have ADHD and autism, and I know that I have, you know, like these extreme highs and lows where it's like either everything in the world is clicking or it's just like things just aren't working at all. And it is really interesting to like even like, you know, like analyze images that come from both spaces and see, you know, where do they kind of like calibrate and where's the friction between those things as well. You know, I think for mostly anybody, you can definitely identify, you know, there's just some days where it's just like you could be out for like an 8 hour walk and you come back with nothing. And there could be another day you're out for a 1 hour walk and you come home with like a really good plethora of images that you're like, wow, like where did this all come from? And you know, some days, you know, you're just in tune with the world, but I think just having that constant practice of, you know, like going out there and just aligning yourself with the exterior world definitely helps to, you know, like understand, you know, especially understand when there are times when things just don't work. You know, I think that's something that really demotivates a lot of people is, you know, if you're only going out, you know, like let's say a few times a month to make images or to think about photography or, you know, just having photography in your life as general, you're going to get really, I think, demotivated pretty quickly whenever things don't work, whenever versus you're going out there on a more constant and you're starting to learn the routine of like, yeah, some days things just don't work. You know, it's just the same thing with, you know, at creatives or athletes or, you know, just some days you wake up and you spill coffee. You know, and it's just getting, I guess, you know, to feel comfortable with that routine of life through using a camera.
And for me too, I have to say that going out and shooting has immense therapeutic value for me.
Mm.
Like it does regulate my moods. If I'm in a bad mood and I go out, I'll always get a couple of shots in, you know, and it's really been vital, I feel like, for me maintaining my mental health through the pandemic and also since then. And so, yeah, it's true. You know, you can have a disappointing day out, but I feel like I'm an incredibly omnivorous shooter. Like I will just every single opportunity, and then I come home with this, you know, great pile of photos, and then it comes the act of categorizing, and that's also a creative act.
Mm-hmm.
Like where are you putting these images? How are you putting them together? And so that I feel like what I'm doing is building a visual lexicon, you know, with my archives. And so, like, really taking off of this tradition of the, you know, topographical approach to photography, where I've got collections of, you know, files with like 1,000 found sculptural circumstances, or you know, the ways that people fix fences with wires. I've got like 500 photos of that. And so you start to be able to accumulate these different categories of photos that you can then work with, which is kind of what happened with our book, the call and response book. You know, Matthew sent me this series of photos, and I was able to engage with them like on a deep level by like digging into these archives and looking at color and form and how these images can speak to each other, how you can play with scale, how you can play with, again, complementary colors, colors that are playing off of each other. Everything doesn't have to be symmetrical either. So there's just so much to play with. So, you know, I went in and found a response for each of these. Well, not each of them, like there was a whole process, but and then some of them I left 4 options there as possible matches, and then Matthew went back and went through that, and it kind of like a choose your own adventure. He selected images that he felt worked with the aesthetic that he was going for with Urban Avalon Press. So, you know, it was an interesting process to go through, but I love being a part of these projects that allow me to dig into these archives. And I am a part of a couple ongoing projects that are keeping me engaged that way.
And it's interesting to see you both have like similar but different views on like the idea of just like going out and shooting and the like. It's weird thinking that whole conversation stemmed from like writing and photography and that idea of imposing yourself on the world and it imposing on you. But I thought it was really interesting what you said about like trying to process the chaos, but also it being like mundane, because mundane implies that it's something boring. And like Matt, you talking about like the lack of not a lack of subjects, but not finding the subject important, more about the form and the shapes and the colors and things, and being a bit more, visually almost abstract. And I think that connection of seeing the mundane in a different light that's where you're putting yourself in, right? That's where that internal world impedes.
That's really also where the mundane becomes elevated, right?
Yes.
Like when you can recognize that that perfect, again, alchemy of balance in a frame where the light's hitting that garden hose just right in a way that it becomes more than just a garden hose in that frame. And it could be anything else outside the frame, but as long as it's all working like within the frame, like whatever that balance is that you're going for, then that's it. That's the magic.
Yeah, absolutely. I think too. I think what's interesting too is, I think Dean and I have known this about each other just from going on photo walks together and stuff like that. But it was really a fun experience to work on the zine together, because we definitely have similarities, but then we definitely have some polar aspects to the way we work and the way we think and everything like that. And it was really fun to kind of rein in those two ideologies into a functioning form afterwards, because I'm someone who is extremely, I wouldn't just say that Dean is not an intuitive person whatsoever, but I think less about what I'm seeing. It's more of a visceral reaction that I have to things. And and it's quite often depending on the type of thing that I'm working on. If it's something specific that I'm working on, I've even found pretty much, I would almost say probably 100% of the time, that whatever got me into working on something is never the end result. It's like an idea that gets you in there. And quite often I find that's a really interesting thing, is that these I don't want to say preconceived ideas, but these ideas that we have about, a photo project, for example, just I'll use one of my own just off the cuff is I was supposed to be working with the local museum in my hometown of Cornwall, Ontario, on a project about the historical landscape of Cornwall. I'm a huge history nerd. I love history. History is probably what has gotten me into 80% of my photo projects, is just a real love for history, finding out things, trying to retrace steps, and then whenever that project starts taking form and nearing completion and looking back on it and just being like, wow, there's nothing about history here at all. That was what got me in the door. But at the end of the day, it was just more my interest in being out in the world and reacting to it and having these things in my mind, like, okay, there used to be railroad tracks that ran here. Let's use that as a jumping off point. But I think quite often I'm always chasing the memory of a memory. And I have a real interest in that, I think because I have a very poor memory, probably for one. So maybe that is where my core interest in history comes from. But I think there's just like a real interest in also working with people like Dean, who, like you said, he has like, he truly does have like a lexicon of images. It's incredible. It's impressive. The Beschers would be very proud of Dean. And whereas me, it's just like, it's just a folder of images that share a likeness. And, I have no classification. I sometimes do inventories to be like, okay, like how many of this image do I have? How many of that image do I have? And that is helpful, just having an understanding of like, okay, like how much of that one kind of form was I obsessed with versus the other thing I thought that I was obsessed with, and I have like one picture of it. But it was really fun to go and do the zine, because a lot of my choices were just like gut reactions. It's just like the photos that I sent Dean were just 20 photos that I had, kind of, I think it was maybe even more than 20, maybe 25.
Something like that, yeah.
Something like that. But, they've just been photos that I pulled out of my little folder of color images, and I just had them pinned up on my wall. And I stared at them long enough to be like, okay, like these photos are the photos I want to use. And I sent them over to Dean, and Dean had a completely different way of, processing his reaction to those images, which was honestly for me like so interesting because it's very opposite from how I work, but it produced such great end results.
I have to like have one point of disagreement there with Matthew in that I feel like I'm almost completely an intuitive photographer. In that I don't go out with a particular project in mind. I go out. I'm reactive and cumulative. So like I take photos of absolutely every opportunity, like in a state of absolute openness, walking around these alleys, like any opportunity. And I've just got this new macro lens, which is like now opening up whole new worlds for me. So I'm just reacting to my environment intuitively when I go out. And then, as I said, I come home and I've got this accumulation of images that I then categorize. So the categorization happens after the fact. I'm just going out with as much openness to the world and like trying to capture every opportunity that comes my way, every opportunity of light, texture, like shadow, mood. Like I'm trying to be open to the mood of the world that's around me and to be able to recognize all of these tonalities of mood. And so for me, the creative process also comes through how you sequence, And so that's also where diving into the archives and deciding which of these categories am I going to put together here, because the different categories will create an entirely different lexicon. It will create an entirely different poetics of image. And when you think about sequencing, there's a linguistic element and there's a musical element for me. There is a rhythm that you can create with language, with images, and language, where you can create visual rhythms and also like images can be sequenced as grammars, right? And so like the way that you order it, it becomes almost like an equation. You could do an A plus B in a bracket with C, and you can start to actually equate these grammars of image. That's kind of where I'm going, with what I want to do, like for my next books. But like really getting into the linguistic and musical elements of sequencing, and that's what really I was responding to with Matthew with our call and response book. I was looking for these opportunities for harmony. Again, going back to a musical metaphor, but I was looking for a visual harmony, and like with a certain tolerance for ambiguity, let's say. And I really like working with that loose abstraction, that sense of play that you can create in sequencing and pairing. And so that's why it was exciting, for me to be able to dig into these archives that way.
That's awesome that you see the idea of like musically doing it and then linguistic as well, because a lot of people either solely focus on sort of one or the other, or like lean more into, like, a lot of people talk about the language of photography. Weirdly, it has actually been more recently, more people have used musical terms. I spoke to another press should be a few episodes back by the time this one comes out, but he talked about the way he arranges his photo books for people is almost like notes in a song, and trying to create that sort of like almost a composition rather than a straight written piece with the photographs.
Well, yeah, I mean, for me too, it's like language and music together is poetry. So that's where you get a visual poetics, really. Yeah, and that's my approach.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I should probably preface by saying that I picked up a camera about 6 years ago, but and I am still a musician now. But I mean, from the age of 16 to 30, I was actively a musician. I had bands, I worked in the music industry and stuff like that. So I definitely, absolutely think in musical terms, especially when it comes to sequencing. Um, it's one of those things. I actually had recently taken a class with Tim Carpenter through the Penumbra Foundation out of New York City on the structure of the photo book. And one of the things that he had said in that class had really struck me, and it was something that I don't know why I had resisted for so long within my own photographic process, especially the post process of editing and sequencing. But he said that he noticed that with a lot of people, they don't play to their strengths, that they're afraid to play to their strengths. Like especially if they're coming to photography from something else, or they're just picking up photography as a serious hobby, or looking to get into it, that they kind of discredit their whole past life and all the strengths that their past life bring to this creative process using a camera. And it got me thinking because for the class, the way it was structured, you came with a PDF of a photo book that you're working on, and by the end of the 4 classes, you had to have a completely restructured PDF of your photo book. And I was sitting there being like, well, I know music. I've been doing music my whole life. I mean, I can't go a day without music. I'm like, why have I been ignoring that aspect of potential within the sequencing process? And the book I was working on talks deeply about the kind of routine nature of clinical depression or chronic depression, and how that kind of flows into a very 9 to 5 work week, and all that kind of like the flow of the month. A new month begins, and you're like, okay, the typical Western idea of putting all these kind of labels like TGIF and Hump Day, and it's the weekend, all that kind of stuff. And working as I have for the past 16 years, working in a warehouse, in a pharmacy, and you hear just generic pop songs on the radio, and there's nothing wrong with pop music. But after a while, it's just a lot of the same repetitiveness. And I was like, well, why don't I use a pop song structure, an A B A B C B, pop song structure to sequence this book? So I kind of got into this rhythm of like, oh, okay, well, there's a way we can do that with this. And with call and response, it's the same thing. It's an idea of the musical call and response. Someone makes a call, the audience gives a response back, and that's why we chose to have the front and back cover be pianos, or dismantled and disregarded pianos in a piano graveyard. But it was
because we had both found the same piano graveyard at different times in that neighborhood and shot it. And like when I was going through, I was like, oh, I got one for that.
Oh, nice. It's interesting to see, because and to see that it's come through to that level to where, like, in plain sight, I've looked at the front cover of that book every day, every time I come up here, and never fully understood the reasoning behind that. And I think that's and it's been there in literal plain sight, which I think speaks to the fun part of photo books, is normally things hide in plain sight, and they're almost, and then you dig a little deeper and people have some really amazing things. That's such a
that cover is a good example of I'm really interested in the kind of material conditions of the world. And the way things accumulate, the way things overflow, and the way, like, in an urban environment, you can just come across these scenes of, like, it's a construction site or it's an industrial space, and they've just dumped a bunch of tubing in a field, and then you come across it, and it very much is a sculptural circumstance, and these things get weathered, they get rained on, they have all kinds of chemical processes working on them, like oxidation, and it's transforming them constantly, and it's transforming the environment constantly, and that for me is of great interest. And I managed to become a part of this project here in Canada called Sculpture a Day. And they've got an Instagram profile, but they also run their own website. It's Sarah Graham. She's a Canadian artist, and it was started around 10 years ago now as almost a joke for established Canadian artists who just like if they find something in their day-to-day that looks sculptural, they would post it, and it almost as a joke originally, but it just kept going, and it kind of had a life of its own. And then, you know, eventually I took an interest and started sending a few photos their way. And but the thing is that literally is my subject matter as a photographer. So, and then there has now been a few other people who, you know, are doing the same thing and who are noticing these material conditions of the urban environment and these opportunities that are out here visually. It's grown into other things like for example, what is it? There's The City is Ours is a Finnish publication where he's very much interested in, again, like these same concerns. And so it's like it's something that's expanding, and where opportunities have been coming for me through Sculpture a Day, through other publishers, you know, who are also interested in this subject matter. So it's been this kind of organic I don't know, evolution of this niche interest.
Has that been like a recent thing where it suddenly kind of exploded? Because it sounds
over
like
the last year or so, I've had a few opportunities come up. Like, I'm also a part of a project called PHOTOMAFIA Palavras, which is a Portuguese project where they send me Portuguese literary quotes, and I'll again get into the archives and respond with an image that speaks to the literary quote in tone or, you know, emotional tenor or literally to some degree. So again, these ongoing projects that I've been lucky enough to get involved with keep me going and keep me using my archives and keep inspiring me with photography and challenging me to kind of engage with other people, you know, with other artists and other people who have their own vision for what all of this can be.
That's cool. And I was going to ask Matt as well. You mentioned earlier with Cool Response that even earlier at the podcast, you mentioned you're more of a monochrome shooter, and then you dug out color images for this project. Was that knowing that would fit more with what you'd seen from Dean, or was that just a decision all of your own? Was that the first sort of?
Actually, it actually came from. I'm not one to usually speak about gear, but this is definitely a circumstance where gear kind of changed my workflow a little bit. Up until that point, I had been using mirrorless cameras, and most of the time I would set the viewfinder to view in monochrome, or I was working in black and white film for the most part. And that camera that I had broke. At the time, I couldn't afford a new camera, and someone had generously gifted me an old Pentax K7, which is a DSLR. And I just found the experience of just looking through the ground glass. I mean, no different than using a film camera, but you know, a film camera, I've been dedicated to shooting black and white film for quite a while. And it was just something about, you know, seeing colors through the viewfinder, where I'd been so used to kind of training myself to see everything in black and white, and setting the viewfinder to look at the world in tonality and shades and stuff like that. That actually had kind of just made me fall in love using that camera strictly for color photography. There was just something about, you know, like actually focusing on color and finding, you know, circumstances where, you know, you had complementary colors or conflicting colors, or, you know, just really focusing on how color changed a scene versus, you know, when it's just reduced to tonalities from, you know, black to white. And it was at that time I was actually preparing to leave Montreal to move stateside, which I did for a short period of time until I had to come back, so my situation didn't work out. But before I was leaving, I just became kind of hyper focused with this idea of like, well, what would the color palette of the city of Montreal be? And thinking about, well, every major city must have some kind of like unique textural and color palette to it, just how citizens use that city, how people make their mark on the landscape, whether that's from graffiti to construction to like instances like these talking about people mending fences or gates with little pieces of wire, or the leftover of like tape on a pole or staples on a pole. Like Montreal just, we seem, I don't know if it's because our city has so much construction happening in it at all times. I mean, like that's kind of like a running joke with the city of Montreal, mainly because the mafia at an early stage got involved with the construction industry, and they kind of used it to turn a profit. So the city has been under construction for negligence of things that need to be fixed, and then a lot of things that are just fixed and fixed and fixed and fixed again, just to kind of keep a cash flow going through the pockets of people. But I don't know if it's because of that our city just has, with the way citizens maybe see it and use it, there's just such a heightened sense, probably like New York City, heightened amount of just graffiti, wheat paste posters, just little leftover parts of like detritus and stuff like that. There is a real charming sense to it, as much as it can be visually unappealing, in the sense of like most people want to live in a clean and well maintained environment. But like there's something about that chaos that the construction brings to the city that is just fun.
Yeah. Also, the way that the city is laid out, the alleys run in a way that, like, we have generally three-story walk-ups in a lot of the city, and that the yards are tiny, really small. And so when you're walking down these alleys, you basically have a full view into people's yards and people's lives. And these alleys are public spaces, and like you get a lot of spillover. You get people taking ownership of their alleys, yes. And they have these green alleys where they're planting plants in the alleys, and they're like making it more community friendly. But then again, the kind of chaos that Matthew's talking about, the kind of not every yard is so well maintained. I've had people come out and like apologize to me because the state of their garage, and I'm saying no, I love this rust. Like keep the decay. Like this is the character of the city. Like all of these condos are destroying it. They're like ruining the flow of the alleys. Like they're cutting off alleys. And another distinct thing about Montreal is there are industrial areas kind of embedded within residential areas, yes. Very close. And so these industrial areas are extremely accessible to anyone. And so it makes the city kind of ripe for exploring these kind of environments, for sure.
That sounds cool. Yeah, like you say, it's not like normal people want somewhere clean and kind of control. But I think for photographers, it's places with a little bit of edge. We had a friend, he's Swedish, and he moved to Copenhagen, and then he moved to Malmo because Copenhagen was too clean and he couldn't take photos there. He needed somewhere a bit more sort of gritty and rough. And it's
in September. I had an opportunity to go to Portugal because I had a show as a photo as a part of a show for that PHOTOMAFIA Palavras project that I was telling you about. And while I was there, I visited Porto and Lisboa and a number of places, and yeah, super inspired by Porto. Wow, it's like the Montreal of Portugal. Just so much excellent decay and texture and grit, and the tiles add a whole other level of kind of visual appeal there too. So again, going back to Matt, what Matthew was saying about cities having their own distinct character and their own distinct grit and their own distinct kind of rough edges. Like that's really what attracts me. And yeah, I just had so much fun shooting photos in Portugal and retraining your eye to see the way that the light's different there and the way that things just hit differently there is for me super inspiring.
No, and I think also maybe on the same point. I think because I think that's also maybe a point of contention with photography as well, and with photographers, is that kind of, I won't go to the point of going to the extreme of like stuff like ruin porn and stuff like that, but there is definitely an obsession with that kind of very rough character, always looking for things that definitely have more friction. And I think that it is an interesting point of contention in photography, just, where when something is functional and clean and, there is no real friction to it, it becomes very unphotographable in a sense, or hard to photograph, or much harder to, find a way to photograph it to make it interesting. But I think at the same time, probably one of the main reasons for that is that, photography is, I think, just by its inherent nature, it's fundamentally looking at two things, life and death. And, if, you're interested in photographing something, well, it's not so much that decay isn't a sign of, things dying and falling apart. It's a sign of something that has lived, or something that has been lived in. There's a sign of life. And whenever things, certain, let's say here in Montreal, having this, massive surge of these, kind of prefab condominiums coming in that are devoid of, any kind of, aesthetic value really to them, but they kind of strip away that sense of an area having life, something being lived in. And I think that's why a lot of people, whenever we think of places that are very interesting in Europe, places like Greece, for example, or Rome or something like that, or, in the Middle East, or, in India or China, it's these places that have these long outstanding histories. I mean, England as well, there's a reason why people, castles are interesting. It's because, it's a sign that life has been here for a long time. Even if maybe it might be falling apart or something like that, but it's a sign that life has been there. I don't think it's so much as an affirmation of death and decay, but an affirmation of life and people persevering. And I think that's what is probably so beautiful about it.
I have to agree absolutely with that, in that going back to my interest in the material realities of the city, I'm interested in all aspects of the transfer. Like the city is constantly under a process of transformation. And for me, in a sense, I'm interested in documenting that transformation. So not only the decay, but also the rebuilding. I'm interested in, if I can get on a construction site, that's why my GFX has a cracked screen right now, because I was jumping a fence on a construction site and screwed that up. So every aspect. It's Kali, the god of decay, of death and rebirth. And there's a rebirth that's occurring, and the city's constantly trying to redefine itself, and there's all these economic forces that are also pushing it in different directions. And I'm very interested in those processes. Absolutely.
Yeah. I was talking about Teju Cole and his book Blind Spot, which is basically text and image. Beautiful book, highly recommend it. But there's a photograph in there, and it's of construction material kind of arranged in a front yard somewhere. And I'm going to be just paraphrasing it because I can't remember the quote exactly. But it just really struck me because the quote was kind of basically, to summarize it, was saying that, renovation is a sign of hope. That, it's constantly, it's just basically a sign that we're always trying to better things, even if, we fail at that, it's just the endeavor of trying to make something better that counts. And I think that is probably, I think what, both Dean and I share a love for same thing. I mean, I think I'm not just attracted to areas that are in one specific state. I am interested in seeing how two different states converge and line up on top of each other. I mean, like, I can only imagine what that's like in Europe, where you have such an ancient history, or, somewhere like in, like, like the Middle East, or Asia, where, there's such ancient histories, and not all of it has been modernized, but for sure there are cities everywhere in the world with, great ancient histories and structures that still remain, that are, juxtaposed against extremely, modern, minimalist, prefabricated, capitalist structures. So I think it is just interesting just to see, how people try to maintain that, balance with their worlds around them. And, like a great example, like Dean was saying, like here in Montreal, like, there are plenty of green alleyways where you go down them, and it's not just, like people, making like little, planter boxes in, like, their alleyways and stuff like that. They become a communal space for barbecues in the summertime, and for children to play safely, away from, like, like the front streets of the houses where, cars and buses are zooming by and stuff like that. So it's just, for me, I think it's just like I said, just kind of like an affirmation of life and endurance and persevering.
But at the same time, I really did develop a kind of ethics for shooting in these spaces, because when you're walking down these alleys and you have this privileged view into people's lives, like, I don't take photos of people who are, in their backyards. I don't, like, there is a line there.
Yeah.
But, if the fence is open and the light's hitting that hammock right, I might sneak in and take the photo. It's a bit like the tree falling in the forest, that's my philosophy to it. But, I have been called out a few times for that, like taking a photo over a fence and somebody saying, you don't have a right to take that photo. And, like, it's like, that's not your hammock. And how should, why should you profit off of that? And, I'm not profiting in any large way off of, those photos. And, it's a discussion to be had. And I have been, confronted a number of times by people also in, like, again, these unphotogenic industrial areas where, it's like an auto shop district, and they're like, what are you taking photos? Like, what could you possibly be taking photos of? Like, we thought you were the police. We thought you were, you were like working for our competition. We thought you were, or like you're in a certain neighborhood and they think you want to, like, buy out people's property, and like, So there's a lot of assumptions people make about you, especially with a camera moving through a space, that I've become aware of. And we have the conversation. I'll break out my Instagram account and show people that, like, hey, this is legit my art practice. And usually people are like, oh, okay, yeah, that's cool, and it's fine. But you kind of have to get past that initial distrust or those kind of questions about, who are you, and what are you doing in these kind of gray areas that are between public and private spaces.
Yeah, and it's such a difficult thing to navigate, because you can almost, as well as, like, I'm similar to you in that I shoot a lot of not people, a lot of objects, but tends to mean that, like, when situations do come up where you eventually have to photograph people, it's like, so where's the line? And am I imagining it that they're gonna, like, photographers seem to get in their head that if you point a camera at someone, that person is going to, like, punch you in the face, which has happened, like, increasingly, but sure. And it's weird because it changes in different parts of the world. I was
different laws.
Yeah, different laws. I mean, like, what you were saying about, like, in the industrial estates resonated, like, wasn't that long ago in like London, that like, sort of the very big sort of banking buildings and stuff, their security guards were, like, accusing people taking photos for being, like, terrorists and stuff, and it became, like, an issue. And there's other places, like, I went to Morocco, and there it was like, and it was, hell because I'm going there on a commission to shoot, and then like a week before I'm going, my friend's like, you know, no one there will let you take your photo. Like they're like very against it. Like you're gonna get shouted at in the views, and I'm like, oh, God, but this is the job. Like I have to like figure it out, and it was fine, but like it's just a totally different culture around it. Like they just do not want to be photographed.
I've had that too with like scrap yards, for example. If I'm sneaking onto a scrap yard lot, and like they very much don't want you on there because they think you're casing out the place. You know, they think you're, you know, like, oh, you've got this much tubing, you've got this much copper. And, you know, I'm just looking for the stuff that looks cool. But it's not a conversation they want to have. So you're just out of there. So, yeah. So, but yeah, photographing people is something that I do often more almost for scale. Like I had a Montreal Metro series that I did during the pandemic. And as I was saying, a lot of my photography practice came out of the pandemic. So I was actively staying out of people's faces, staying away from people. And so it hasn't, like the last couple of years, I have been a little more comfortable with photographing people, even asking some people if they mind. I'm a little more comfortable with that than just doing candid shooting of people. But yeah, I'm more warming up more and more to the idea of it. But more in the past, it's been for scale with architecture and that kind of thing, and where it's like they probably didn't notice I took the photo to begin with, and they don't have to worry about their face being seen.
Yeah, it's definitely a strange interaction to have to deal with and navigate, because also inevitably as well, like I'm sure you've experienced it, some perfect shot that's been handed to you from some almost higher being, and there's someone right where they shouldn't be in the photo just to sort of get in the way, which is another one of like, well, is that how it's meant to be, or do I wait, do I, you know, it just
take it.
Funny.
Ask questions later.
Which is great advice. Just to sort of wrap things up, because we've gone for about an hour or so, is there anything else you want to discuss or get off your chest, or just, you know, any hot takes or anything?
Well, I think I'll just say that for Urban Avalon Press, there will be other publications coming. It will be a slow endeavor because I'm doing it by myself, and there is for sure a project that will be coming out this year between two Western Canadian photographers, one out in Alberta and the other one in Winnipeg. So that will be coming out this year. So yeah, just a little self-plug for that, just to be on the lookout for that. So I'm looking forward to working with both those photographers on that whenever they're both ready, and that's why I'm not disclosing any names at this time, but that will be coming out this year at some point.
Nice.
Yeah, and for me, I wanted to say, I was talking before about that The City Is Ours book project. So it was actually a book called Involuntary Sculptures that was put out on other editions, and so yeah, that was kind of exciting to put together, and that was Lorenzo Sturvey who put that together. So just to put that out there, look him up, look up other editions. There's some really interesting volumes there in the collection, including like the kind of like torn posters, or you know, painted over graffiti, or manhole covers, or these kind of urban interests that are niche, but like for me pretty fascinating. So anyways, want to promote that for them. They're doing interesting things.
I'll definitely have to check that out, and look forward to seeing the next book from Urban Avalon as well. Other than that, thanks for taking your Sunday morning, my Sunday evening to come and chat. It's been good. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah,
so
thank you for having us.
Yeah, it's been fun.